Thank you for joining us at the Evolution of Medicine Summit. A warm welcome. We wanted to make a specific thank you to our sponsors that have made this event possible. Energetics, an innovative natural remedy and supplement company, is committed to revitalizing medicine, and Cyrex Labs, a clinical immunology laboratory specializing in functional immunology and autoimmunity. Most of all, thank you for listening. If you'd like to share this with your colleagues and friends on Facebook if you enjoy the content, and if you have questions, you can ask us on Twitter with the hashtag EvoMed. Finally, if you really want to play your part in accelerating the evolution of medicine, ask your doctor if the Evolution of Medicine Summit might be right for them. Thank you and enjoy. Hello and welcome back to the Evolution of Medicine Summit. It is a great day and I am really excited to introduce you to my next guest, and he probably needs very little introduction. I'm here with Dr. Tom Obryan. Doctor, great to have you here today and thank you for being on the summit.
Thank you, James. It's really an honor to be a part of this summit. Thank you.
Dr. Tom Obryan has worn a number of hats over his career. He's a chiropractor. He has taught at the Institute of Functional Medicine and a number of other areas. But the area that I think that maybe history will remember Dr. Obryan for is the Gluten Summit that was last year. And it was a big part of my desire to do this summit. Came about just by seeing the sort of the global impact that the Gluten Summit had. I heard from friends on the other side of the world that they had been listening in and how impactful they thought the information was and how well it was delivered. And that really sort of put a bee in my bonnet to want to use this same sort of technology to be able to get this information out. And that was sort of the genesis of the Evolution of Medicine Summit. And so it's such a pleasure to have you here, Dr. Obryan. You know, I would ask the first question. It's a while since you've done that first Gluten Summit. If you had to look back at the past year and the time that's happened, what would you say has been the sort of the overall impact, if you could whittle it down to just a little?
Well, yes, and thank you. A paper was published 2011 in the New England Journal of Medicine that said that the average length of time from when translational research, which is research that changes the way doctors think, the average from when that research is first published before the doctor down the street is using that information in his practice, the average is 17 years.
Wow.
17 years. From the time cholesterol was first published as perhaps it has something to do with cardiovascular disease, before the doctor down the street was checking cholesterol levels. Okay. 17 years. And I made a declaration that's not going to happen with an awareness that in some people gluten sensitivity can be a problem. And that was the creation of the Gluten Summit, and the result has been we've gotten lots of validation that we have moved the needle of awareness. And we've taken it forward by years now because actually hundreds of thousands of people now are talking about this topic of non-celiac gluten sensitivity and how prevalent it is.
That's awesome. Well, that's why we're here, and that's why we're getting started on the evolution of medicine. My goal is to accelerate that evolution, and I feel like this is a great topic. So today we're here to just talk a little bit about gluten and autoimmune disease, because I know that the Gluten Summit was just the beginning of your journey to tell the world about autoimmune disease and what you feel is really at the core of it. Why are you so passionate about autoimmune disease? What is it that drives you to really talk about this as a big issue?
It's commonly known in the medical literature that the number 3 cause of getting sick and dying is called morbidity and mortality. The number 3 cause is autoimmune diseases. You know, we think of them separately, that every autoimmune disease is in its own silo. Like on a farm, they've got silos of corn. So if you have a skin condition, psoriasis, you go to a dermatologist. If you have MS, you go to a neurologist. If you have Crohn's disease, you go to a gastroenterologist, and never do the two talk. So people are limited to go within the silo of what their symptoms are. But when you look at it from a bigger picture, as our immunologists do, when you look at autoimmune diseases from a bigger picture, it's the number 3 cause of getting sick and dying. It's that prevalent. And as a result of that, there's been so much research done that they've identified that there's a trilogy in the development of autoimmune diseases. There's 3 things that commonly occur for us to develop this number 3 cause of getting sick and dying. And those three things in the trilogy are: one, you have to have the genetic vulnerability. It doesn't mean you're going to get it, but it means it's the weak link in your chain. You're more vulnerable to that particular autoimmune condition. Two is the environmental trigger has to set it off, kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. And three is intestinal permeability. And the paper started coming out in 2005 that said, and this is their language, you can arrest the development of autoimmune disease by healing the gut, addressing intestinal permeability. Now, it just happens that the most common environmental trigger that causes this mechanism to go into play is the most common food that we eat in our culture today, and that is wheat. That we don't think of it that way, but you have toast for breakfast, sandwich for lunch, pasta for dinner, bagels for breakfast, cookies at lunch, croutons on the salad at dinner. That wheat is in so many products that almost all of us are exposed to it multiple times a day, every day.
So this is much bigger than understanding people about celiac or gluten sensitivity. We're talking about something that's really going to, potentially bankrupt America. Autoimmune disease, third biggest cause of disease. This is a serious problem.
That's exactly right. If you think of it this way, that what takes us down eventually, any one of us, what's going to take us down? And you pull at a chain, the chain always breaks at the weakest link. It's at one end, the middle, the other end. It's your heart, your liver, your brain, your kidneys, wherever your genetic weak link is. When our body starts to break down, that's where it's likely to break down. So it's the pull on the chain. Now, the weak link is your genetic vulnerability, but it's the pull on the chain that causes the symptom patterns to develop. Now, we typically call that stress. Now, stress can be emotional, it can be the foods that we eat, it can be psychological, it can be structural, but the most common one is environmental exposures, and that causes different types of biochemical stress. And the pull on the chain, the most common pull on the chain for most of us is the foods that we eat.
Yeah.
And the most common food we're sensitive to is gluten.
Okay. So you did the gluten summit, and a lot of people, hundreds of thousands of people listened to it. As a result of this, have you had feedback from the population? Do you have some examples of successes as a result of people taking this information and using it?
My gosh, we received over 18,000 thank yous. 18,000. Wow. I had a staff of 8 working 8 hours a day, sometimes 10 hours a day, every day, just reading these emails and trying to respond to some of them. It was unbelievable. My staff had tears in their eyes most every day, and I stayed up many nights until 2 or 3 in the morning until I just couldn't read any more of these emails. Again and again, thank you very much. You saved my daughter's life. Her juvenile idiopathic rheumatoid arthritis went into complete remission within a month on a gluten-free diet. Unbelievable things like that. My wife's MS has reduced dramatically. My rheumatoid arthritis, the symptoms are all gone. I'm sleeping better. The list goes on and on and on. Wherever the weak link in the chain is, that's where the symptoms are manifesting. When you stop pulling on the chain, that's where you're likely to see the benefits. It's literally 18,000. I'll just read to you what a couple of doctors said about this. Well, here's a patient one. Living in a city with no information on celiac has always been my main concern as a new diagnosed patient. But after this summit, I no longer let myself be pushed around by doctors who never open their minds to the real problem in their patient's health. Having more information brings me knowledge to understand and help myself and address properly the problems and issues with doctors that take care of me. Medication impaired me for a long time, and finally I am free to understand what's going on, especially with my father. He is a doctor who doesn't believe that celiac is a big problem and has always watched me having problems in my gut and prescribed many of the pills that I took for so long. Even now he thinks celiac is no longer a problem and I can eat bread from time to time. Thank you for validating this issue and giving me back my life. I really have no words from my family, me, my son, my daughter, and my husband. So that's a common representation that some of our doctors haven't had a chance to read the more current information on how this gluten sensitivity may manifest. And to think that you can have wheat once in a while if you're a celiac, my gosh, that's almost malpractice. The rule is you can't be a little pregnant
Yeah.
You can't have a little gluten.
Yeah.
If you have celiac, you cannot, because just one exposure and you activate your immune system with at least 90 days of antibodies that are causing more inflammation wherever the weak link in your chain is.
That's so interesting. Well, in this summit, we've got some great doctors who are ahead of the curve, and I really feel like the work that you're doing is accelerating this evolution of medicine. So that's why I had to have you on, and I'm so glad that you're here. So we're going to spend today talking a little bit more about autoimmune disease, because I think it's obviously a huge topic, third biggest cause of mortality, morbidity. Maybe perhaps you could just sort of explain at a sort of an overview level, how does something that gluten, where it's to do with the gut, how does that end up manifesting into autoimmune diseases that are not of the gut, that are of the joints or of the thyroid or otherwise?
Sure, you bet. And that mechanism, we'll go to it. There's a number of parts to it. I'd start by saying, and the papers are very clear on this, the research papers, for every one celiac patient that has GI symptoms, there are 8 that don't. It's in their brain, or in their kidneys, or in their lungs, or in their joints. The ratio is 8 to 1. It's not.
Wow.
You can't suspect celiac only when there are gut symptoms. It may manifest as attention deficit. It may manifest as rheumatoid arthritis. It can manifest as so many different conditions, autoimmune or not autoimmune. I think the rule of thumb that we learned in the Gluten Summit was that whenever your current protocols are not helping the patient feel like $1 million, they're doing exactly what you tell them to do, and you believe it's going to work, and whenever it's not getting those results that you want, just think, maybe there's a gluten sensitivity. I might just want to check.
Yeah.
So that's an overview of who should be checked. Everyone should be checked who doesn't feel like $1 million, because it's going to manifest wherever the weak link is in your chain. Any tissue of your body may manifest that symptom. And then people and doctors will come up to me at breaks in the seminars, and they'll say, well, what about primary sclerosing cholangitis? I say, sure, the papers came out from Mayo Clinic in the journal Liver on primary sclerosing cholangitis as a manifestation of celiac disease. Once again, doctor, any link in the chain may be where it manifests. Then someone else will come up and say, well, what about juvenile idiopathic arthritis? I say, any system of the body may manifest. Yeah. So that's the overview of who would consider, should I consider gluten maybe is a problem for me.
But anyone with autoimmune disease, right?
Absolutely, absolutely, without doubt, slam dunk, everyone with autoimmune conditions that have been diagnosed. Everyone.
So what are the top for the people at home who maybe don't have it or don't know it? What would you say are the top 5 autoimmune conditions that are prevalent? Things like rheumatoid arthritis is one, right?
Yes, rheumatoid arthritis, type 1 diabetes, skin conditions like psoriasis.
We were speaking a little bit about lupus earlier.
Lupus is a very common one. Any autoimmune disease of the liver. There's an excellent research paper that came out from Mayo Clinic in 2007 called The Liver and Celiac Disease for our healthcare practitioners or the general public. You can go to PubMed, and PubMed stands for Public Medical Information. It's pubmed.gov. It's National Library of Medicine, and it opens up on the search engine. You've got 15 million, literally, 15 million research articles on that search engine. You just type in the liver in celiac disease, and here pops that article from Mayo Clinic. And they list the autoimmune diseases of the liver that may be the manifestation of celiac disease. So it can manifest as any. So liver dysfunction, skin, brain, gut, Crohn's and colitis are so very common. Type 1 diabetes, the most common. Thyroid is extremely common. And thyroid is one of the easier ones to reverse, that you see the antibodies to thyroid autoimmune disease called Hashimoto's. You see those go into the normal range after 6 months or a year of accurately identifying and treating this condition. So Dr. Alessio Fasano, who is the chair of pediatric gastroenterology at Mass General Hospital at Harvard, he tells us that no human can digest gluten. No human. So let's go back to what is gluten, if I may, to answer for your audience so that they understand this. First off, gluten is not bad for you. Bad gluten is bad for you. And there's a difference, because there's gluten in rice and there's gluten in corn. They're not bad glutens unless you're sensitive to rice or you're sensitive to corn. And some people are, But in terms of this topic of gluten sensitivity, it really is the toxic gluten proteins in the family of wheat, rye, and barley. Those are the ones that are the problem because they're different than the other gluten proteins. So it's wheat, rye, and barley. And if you think of a gluten protein, think of a protein like a pearl necklace. And when you unclasp the pearl necklace, so that's what our first digestive enzymes do, is they unclasp this big pearl necklace of amino acids. Then you need the digestive enzymes to cut away every pearl from the necklace. And the problem with these toxic glutens is that we don't have the scissors to cut them down into individual pearls, individual amino acids. That's the problem. Humans do not have the digestive enzymes to break down these proteins completely. We'll break it into clumps of 15 or 30 pearls. They're called amino acids, but 15 amino acids, 30 amino acids, 17 amino acids. And those are, the body can't use those to rebuild muscle, rebuild bone, rebuild or make nerve hormones called neurotransmitters. We can't use these amino acids to make new proteins. They're considered toxic, and the immune system responds to those. So no human can digest gluten. Now, that doesn't take away from the point, and I always say this, wheat has saved millions of lives.
Okay.
You know, because when the U.S. ships cargoes, boats full of wheat, of grain, over to famine, countries are going through famines in Africa, you save hundreds of thousands of lives. They have something to eat. It gives them calories. It gives them a little bit of nutrition, not great, but a little. But it also causes this whole inflammatory cascade because autoimmune disease don't come on overnight. They take years to develop. But wheat has saved millions and millions of lives. But in industrialized countries like ours and in Europe, where we've got access to so many different types of food, there is no requirement to eat this grain that no human can digest fully to use all the benefits of. Other grains are easier to digest. So that's why wheat is not good for us. We can't break down the necklace into each pearl of the necklace. It's impossible for humans.
That's interesting. So you said autoimmunity takes a while to develop. So can you just sort of talk us through, you said there was this three-step process. Genetics was first, then this environmental trigger, so that's gluten and other foods. What are some other environmental triggers that are typical with starting this process?
Dairy.
Okay.
Dairy is very common. And there's 3 or 4 that are right at the top of the list. The first one is gluten. Arguably, the second one, it may be dairy, or the second one is the environment of the intestines, called the microbiome.
Okay.
The good guys that are supposed to be in your intestines. And I'm sure other speakers on this summit will talk about this in much more detail. But for your listening audience, there are 10 times more cells of the good bacteria in your gut than all the cells in the human body put together.
Okay.
You add up all the bone cells, muscle cells, organ cells, brain cells, there's 10 times more cells of the good bacteria than all the human cells. And we know that genes control function. Genes turn on actions in the body, genes turn off actions in the body. And these bacteria have 100 times more genes than the human genome.
Wow.
So if there's 10 times more of them and they have 100 times more influence, it's really an interesting discussion, which you and I have not had the opportunity to do yet. It usually begins after the second glass of wine when we say, are we humans with a lot of bacteria, or are we bacteria having a human experience?
It's a super organ.
It's a super organ that's critically important, and cutting edge research today is in the world of enteric neuroscience. That wasn't even around 10 years ago. Now it's postdoctoral level study, and that's the study of how the bacteria in the gut affects the brain and the nervous system. So the arguably second or third, and some may say the first, contributor to the development of intestinal permeability, the gateway in the development of autoimmunity, is the intestinal environment, the good bacteria that's supposed to be there, and too many of the bad bacteria. So those are the majors that you want to look at. Are foods that you might be sensitive to that's causing inflammation in the gut, which causes this intestinal permeability, and also the internal environment of the gut, the microbiome.
Okay, so that's the first and the second, and then the third is this intestinal permeability. Now, this is an interesting topic because if we were having this discussion 20 years ago, leaky gut, which is a sort of another name for that, correct? This would be referred to by almost everyone as quackery.
I can't tell you how many of my patients used to come back to me in the 80s and 90s and say, Doc, I took your information to my internist or to my neurologist, and they said you're a quack.
Yeah.
And that what you're talking about is just utter nonsense. And the gastroenterologists used to believe, and they were taught this, they were taught, and they just believed the textbooks at the time, was that there's an intracellular cement that holds the cells together. And now, technology's improved, and the science is very clear now. We can visualize that the cells open and close. And there's actually, in between the cells of the intestines, it's like the docks, where boats go through docks, and it goes into one area and the gate closes and the next gate opens and the boat goes forward a little bit more and that gate closes and the next gate opens. Those spaces between the cells are called tight junctions. And that's how we absorb most of our foods and our nutrients. So that's getting a little technical. We don't need to go there too much. But the idea of intestinal permeability is so well referenced now in the literature. I'd like to talk for a moment about intestinal permeability.
Well, I think it's important that we do talk about it because we can't just wait until 2030 until people are realizing this.
Right, 17 years down the road.
Yeah.
Exactly right. So in talking about intestinal permeability, I'd like to give you a visual. Your intestines are a tube. The tube's 20, 25 feet long. It winds around inside the abdomen, twists and turns quite a bit. If you were to think of a donut, and if you could stretch a donut out, one big, long donut, and you look down the center of that donut, down the hole of the donut, that's the intestines.
Yep.
So when you eat food, technically the food is still outside your body when it's in the tube.
Yeah.
Then it's got to go through the tube to get into the bloodstream.
Basically, from your mouth to your colon is like the outside, inside, right?
That's exactly right. It's the outside world that's inside the shell of the body, but it can't get into the body until it goes through the donut, goes through the walls of the donut. Let's talk about the walls of the donut. That inside of the tube is lined with shag carpeting. This shag, and for those of you that don't know, in other countries, shag carpeting is that thick threads of carpet densely put together. It's very thick and plush when you step on it.
Yep.
This shag is where calcium's absorbed. This shag over here may be magnesium. The shags over on the other side are where good proteins are absorbed, good fats are absorbed. All the shags absorb different nutrients. When you have celiac disease, as an example, your shags wear down and you've got Berber. Berber is just flat carpet with no big long threads. And when you have Berber, you don't absorb calcium or vitamin D. You get osteoporosis. That's why in the Annals of Internal Medicine in 2006, they said that every osteoporotic patient needs to be checked for celiac disease, as celiac disease could be the cause of their osteoporosis. So I show doctors that study. So doc, if the Annals of Internal Medicine say every osteoporotic patient just needs to be checked, because it's so common, which one are you not going to check?
Yeah.
Right? And I just let them think about that for a moment. So those are the shags. Now, the shags are covered with a cheesecloth. And just like your grandmother used to pour gravy into the cheesecloth and let the liquid drip out underneath, and it kept all the clumps that it couldn't get through, that's what the shags are for. The cheesecloth on the shags is to only let really small molecules get through the walls of the donut into the bloodstream.
Okay.
Really tiny molecules. And that's the job of the digestive enzymes, is to make the food into those tiny, tiny, tiny molecules that can go right through the cheesecloth into the bloodstream.
The bacteria is helping with that as well, right?
Exactly. Bacteria help with digestion of food. Bacteria helps to tell what's the good guys, what's the bad guys. Bacteria helps a great deal. So when those foods get digested really tiny, they go right through the walls of the donut into the bloodstream. When you eat something that causes inflammation in your intestines, inflammation is like fire, and that inflammation will manifest as tears in the cheesecloth. When you get tears in the cheesecloth, now you get larger parts of these molecules of food, the necklace, that's being broken down, and it just hasn't been in the digestive juices long enough. It's still going down the 20, 25 feet. And it needs to be broken down more before it's small enough to get through the cheesecloth. But now, further up in the intestines, you get this tear in the cheesecloth, and these larger molecules called macromolecules go right through the tears of the cheesecloth into the bloodstream. When that happens, your immune system says, whoa, what's this? This is not good for me. I can't use this to build new muscle cell. I better fight this. And your immune system makes antibodies to that macromolecule. If it happens to be tomatoes, now you get allergies to tomatoes, or beef, or cucumbers, or strawberries. These are the patients that come back on 90 food tests. They're allergic to 15, 20, 25 different foods.
So let me just get that straight, because I've had people tell me, oh, well, if you eat so much of this food, then you automatically become allergic to it. But it sounds like what you're saying is that it has to have, the intestinal permeability has to be there first before that to happen.
That is correct. Okay. It's the macromolecules of the food that get through the tears in the cheesecloth that stimulates the immune system in the bloodstream to make the antibodies to that macromolecule.
So if you have a solid cheesecloth and everything's working perfectly, you can continue to eat foods ongoing. But in the presence of a disrupted internal environment, that will happen with almost every food.
That's exactly right. That's why these people come in and their tests say they're allergic to 20 or 25 different foods, and they can't eat. This is what they can't eat anything. Well, that's why they're allergic to those foods, is because that's what they eat, and the macromolecules get through, and the immune system's trying to protect you. It's not an immune system that's gone crazy. In many cases, it's the immune system doing exactly what it's supposed to do to protect you. And that's why they say you can arrest, and that's the language, arrest the development of autoimmune disease by healing the gut. When you heal the intestinal permeability, 6 months to a year later, you recheck that blood test, you're not allergic to 20 foods anymore. You're not having an immune response. There may be 2 foods that you're having the immune response to, and those are the ones you got to stay away from.
That's interesting. So in this time period between when the gut is breaking down and how long does it take between that process happening and you being diagnosed with an autoimmune disease?
Oh, that's really interesting. And this is a landmark paper that opened up this whole world of study that is so important for all of us to at least know about. This paper was published in 2003. The editor or the author was Arbuckle. And Dr. Arbuckle went to the Veterans Administration Hospital, and she looked for people with the autoimmune disease lupus. The technical name is systemic lupus erythematosus. And she found 130 people in this particular VA hospital with lupus. And if they're in the VA hospital, they're veterans. If they're veterans, they were in the armed forces. If they were in the armed forces, they had their blood drawn many times when they were in the armed forces, when they were healthy and vibrant. And the government's been saving all of that blood since 1978. They've got tens of millions of samples of blood frozen in their blood banks. So Arbuckle asked for permission to go back and look at the earlier blood samples of these patients currently diagnosed with lupus from when they were healthy in the Navy or healthy in the armed forces. What did she find? Well, there are 7 antibodies to lupus, and she found that every one of those antibodies was elevated in those patients years before they ever had any symptoms whatsoever. Maybe they had a blood test because they were sick, and the doctor on the base said, well, let's see if you've got a staph infection, because there had been a staph outbreak on the base. And it came back and they, no, you don't have a staph infection. Go back to work. You're fine. The doctor never would have checked that blood for lupus antibodies. Why would they? Because this is a healthy Air Force person.
Yeah.
They wouldn't think to do that. But now Arbuckle went back and looked, and she found the elevated antibodies to lupus. Years. And the average was 6 years. And some of them 9 years before they ever had one symptom. 9 years beforehand, they had the elevated antibodies. Now, what does that mean? The antibodies are destroying the tissue. Yeah. They're attacking the tissue. When you have elevated antibodies, they're attacking your tissue. They're not calm, peacefully just sitting around with nothing to do. If you have elevated antibodies to your own tissue, that's an autoimmune mechanism that's going on. Now, everybody has small levels of antibodies to their tissue. That's normal. It's kind of like the garbage cleaners that clean up the mess.
Yep.
That's why we have antibodies to our thyroid. or to our adrenals or to our brain. You're supposed to have a little, but not elevated levels. When you have elevated levels, you're killing off too many cells, way too many cells, and that goes on for years. And you know, no one gets Alzheimer's in their 60s or 70s. You get Alzheimer's in your 20s and 30s. It just takes decades before you've killed off enough brain cells that it's obvious. And the speed of degeneration increases as you get older. So you get worse faster, but the mechanism of killing off the brain cells begins decades earlier.
So that seems like it's in common with other chronic diseases. So cancer, pancreatic cancer is developing for 20 years before it's big enough to see. You've got diabetes and pre-diabetes. Now it sounds like this is preemptive autoimmunity. How do you refer it to?
Oh my goodness, you're exactly right on that. And that developed the world of predictive autoimmunity. The godfather of predictive autoimmunity, who we had on the Gluten Summit, Professor Yehuda Schonfeld from Tel Aviv University in Israel. He has a few thousand papers, over 2,000 papers that he's personally written or been a part of the team writing them. And I think his greatest credit is that he has 25 of the PhD students who studied under him who now chair departments of immunology in medical schools and universities around the world.
So is this there never would have been someone who had that sort of understanding chairing boards of immunity and autoimmunity 10 years ago, 20 years ago? Is this new?
Dr. Schonfeld was a pioneer in all of this. He was one of the early voices, and he's been training world-class immunologists now. Have been looking at Arbuckle studied with Schonfeld, and Arbuckle published the lupus paper that I just talked about. So Dr. Schonfeld, because of Arbuckle's paper and Dr. Schonfeld's work, immunologists have been looking at blood banks now since 2003 and publishing papers about rheumatoid patients when they were healthy, MS patients when they were healthy, and they're looking at their blood from these frozen blood banks that we now know. We now know it's called the positive predictive value. If you have elevated antibodies to your own tissue, what's the likelihood that you're going to develop that particular disease? And it's shocking. For example, if you have the elevated antibodies to thyroid called TPO antibodies, thyroid peroxidase antibodies, especially postpartum, if you have elevated TPO antibodies, and they're very common to have elevated and people don't know it, you have a 92% likelihood of developing Hashimoto's within 7 years.
Wow.
If you have elevated antibodies, they're called ASCA antibodies, ASCA antibodies. The papers say anywhere from a 70 to one paper, 100% likelihood you're developing Crohn's disease in 3 years. 3 years if you have elevated ASCA antibodies. And we have this now for many different autoimmune diseases, for rheumatoid and diabetes and scleroderma and lupus. We know the likelihood that the person's going to be killing off more and more tissue and developing that particular disease. And the beauty of getting this umbrella overview, you open an umbrella and you stand underneath it and it protects you, right? The beauty of having this umbrella overview is that it gives you a window of opportunity to do something about the number 3 cause of getting sick and dying years before you've killed off enough cells that you're going to get sick with this and go down.
So before we understood this trilogy, what would doctors tell autoimmune patients? This is just unfortunate. You're never going to cure it. You have to take these drugs. Like, what would they tell them about the cause?
Well, that's exactly right. They'd say, it's genetics, and you've got rheumatoid. Just take this drug for the rest of your life and deal with the side effects. Or MS, and we're really studying, and their research is trying to look for more, but it's just the genes that you have, and it's unfortunate. But here's the medication today to take, and they're treating the symptoms. And in some autoimmune diseases, it helps a little bit, but I'm not aware of any paper ever written about a pharmaceutical approach by itself reversing or arresting autoimmune diseases.
Just managing it.
Managing
the symptoms.
But we've got papers now published in the medical literature on arresting the development of autoimmune disease by healing the gut. You arrest it. You arrest it. You have a family history of degenerative brain disease and cognitive decline, Alzheimer's or dementias. You really want to know about this.
Yeah.
And you really want to know, is my current lifestyle throwing gasoline on the fire in my brain.
So that's quite an empowering message to everyone out there that it's a lot more inside their control. Because otherwise, so I think the most people whose family been in medicine, they just feel like, well, my mum had it and my dad had it. This is something that's going to happen. That's an empowering message to everyone out there, right?
That's exactly right. That is exactly right. Because there is something in many cases that you can do, and functional medicine practitioners have many tools at their disposal because you've got this window of opportunity. Well, Mrs. Patient, your blood tests show that you've got elevated antibodies to your thyroid right now. What does that mean? Well, it means your thyroid is being attacked right now, and you're killing off more cells than you're making. Because we build new cells every day. With new liver cells, new muscle cells, and all that. But I see from this blood test that you've got elevated antibodies to your thyroid. Well, what do? Well, let's see if we can find out why that's happening. And then you go looking into the trilogy and you look to see where's it coming from? What's the trigger? Is there intestinal permeability? Can we heal the gut?
Yeah, that's great. Well, we'll talk a bit later about some strategies for everyone here on the line to start that process and to work with that, because I know everyone knows someone who's got this and they can share that. But we can't really talk about autoimmune disease without looking at this new science of molecular mimicry. I think this is a huge area. For the people who are listening to this now, could you sort of give a bird's eye view of molecular mimicry and how it fits in with what you've just spoken about?
You bet, because it is a primary mechanism of how food sensitivities, and the one that the most research has been done on is on gluten, but other foods may also do this, but how these food sensitivities can cause your body to begin, cause is a strong word, but they say is associated with or may trigger your body making antibodies to your brain or antibodies to your liver or antibodies to your bones, just depending on where your genetic vulnerability is. That this is a primary mechanism by which it occurs. So I want to talk for a minute so that we have a basic understanding of what molecular mimicry is. So when your body eats gluten, if you have a sensitivity to it, what happens is that we can't break it down, no human can. And if you get the tears of the cheesecloth and these larger molecules of gluten, these macromolecules go into the bloodstream and they're traveling around in the bloodstream, your immune system is going to say, whoa, we got a problem here. We need to fight this. And your immune system is going to make antibodies to gluten. Now, what does that mean? This is the way that vaccinations work. You get a shot of the bug measles when you get a measles vaccination. They give you a shot of the bug measles. And your brain says, whoa, what's this? This is not good for me. I better fight this. And you, general, and in your immune system, you have Army, Air Force, Marine Corps generals sitting around with nothing to do.
Yep.
And your brain says, General, you now are General Measles. Take care of this. General Measles builds an assembly line. The assembly line starts producing soldiers. Those soldiers are trained as assassins to go out in the bloodstream and find measles and fire chemical bullets to destroy it.
Yep.
Those soldiers are called antibodies.
Okay.
So you get these measles antibodies going around in the bloodstream. Now, in the bloodstream, it's a big highway. It's all it is. It's a highway. And all the blood's going the same direction, but there's no lanes of traffic. So it's all bouncing into each other. All the molecules are bouncing into each other. So think of this antibodies. These antibodies are out there, and we like to think of it Arnold Schwarzenegger. And we call him the Governator here in California,
okay.
Right? The Governator. And he's got his head out at the sunroof of a Humvee, these big dark glasses on. He's holding a big submachine gun. He goes, over there, over there. And he fires these chemical bullets attacking measles. When all the measles antibodies are gone, General Measles is watching this. And General Measles says, okay, turn off the assembly line. We don't need more soldiers right now. And you stop making antibodies to measles. You shouldn't have antibodies to measles in your bloodstream right now, unless you were exposed, and then you should, but you shouldn't have any. But General Measles is vigilant the rest of his life. This is really important. Vigilant the rest of his life. If measles ever comes back into the bloodstream, he just has to flip the switch. He doesn't have to build the assembly line. Why is that important? Because if you go to Africa to visit, you need vaccinations months ahead of time for yellow fever, dengue fever, all these strange diseases.
Yep.
But if you go back 10 years later to visit again, you just need a booster shot 2 weeks before you go.
Okay.
Right? Because General Measles or General Yellow Fever just has to flip the switch, and in 2 weeks you got the antibodies again.
Okay.
That's what booster shots are for. That means there's a general measles. Well, when you've got gluten, there's a general gluten.
Okay.
If you have a gluten sensitivity. So that wouldn't be a problem, except we have toast for breakfast. General gluten turns on the assembly line. You get sandwiches for lunch, more Arnold's coming out looking for gluten. You have pasta for dinner, more Arnold's come out. You have a bagel the next day, more antibodies are out, firing these chemical bullets that are looking for these gluten pieces of the necklace.
Yep.
Now, the most common piece of the necklace is 33 beads long. That's not too important, except I'm just going to say it's AABCD.
Okay.
It's 33 letters, but we're not going to do that. So let's just say AA. So Arnold's out there looking for AABCD, firing his chemical bullets, looking for AABCD. Now, as the bloodstream goes past the thyroid, as an example, the surface of the thyroid, where the blood's going by, is made up of proteins and fats. Proteins are these bead necklaces, and they're hundreds of beads long. Some of the beads on the bead necklace of thyroid look like AABCD. They're made up of AABCD. So Arnold's looking for AABCD in the bloodstream from gluten, firing these chemical bullets, and he says, oh, look, over there. And he's got these glasses on. He just sees AABCD, but he fires his chemical bullet. He's got these dark glasses. He can't see very well, but he fires these chemical bullets at the thyroid because the surface of the thyroid is AABCD.
He's mistaken it for gluten.
Mistaken identity. It's molecular mimicry.
Okay.
That the surface of the thyroid in this example mimics what looks like the toxic peptides of gluten. Now, that is the most common mechanism by which your body starts making antibodies to the weak link in your chain, wherever it is, if it's your thyroid, or if it's your brain, or if it's your bones, or your muscles, or your joints, from a gluten sensitivity. The most common mechanism is molecular mimicry because AABCD is the same sequence as what Arnold is making, firing chemical bullets at to protect you from the foods that you're eating that are getting in because of the tears in the cheesecloth.
So the gluten is leading to this mistaken identity by being similar to other things that it shouldn't be attacking.
Exactly right. That is exactly right.
Wow, so that opens up, is that the mechanism by which all of these other seemingly unrelated areas to the gut end up being affected by the intestinal permeability and the gluten?
Researchers have written time and time again that the association between the molecular mimicry concept of gluten with other tissue, whether it's liver or brain or thyroid or kidneys, wherever it is, that molecular mimicry is a rational explanation of why this happens.
All right, so now we understand the mechanism by which we can see autoimmune disease and this molecular mimicry. So what do we do about it? What should all of us be doing? And when you speaking to the general public or even doctors, what they should be recommending or otherwise, how can we get the biggest leverage over changing this with sort of the minimal input?
Well, the first concern in answering that question is, do I have a problem or not? And so you don't know. It's because you think, well, I feel fine when I eat wheat. Well, you can't feel that the antibodies to your brain are killing off your brain cells. You don't feel it. So you can't determine by how you feel as to whether or not you have a sensitivity to a particular food or not. It would be ideal if when you ate it, it made you sick. If you throw up, then you just stop doing it right away. But unfortunately, it often doesn't do that. So the question is, do I have a gluten sensitivity? So if people are not feeling marvelous, if they're not having their best day every day from the dietary and nutritional protocols and lifestyle changes that they're doing, they're a little bit better, but they don't feel great. Everyone in that situation should consider, might I have a gluten sensitivity? Because it is so common. Somewhere between, clinically, what we see, depending on the practice, somewhere between 30 to 60% of everyone that comes into the practice will demonstrate an immune response to gluten, a gluten sensitivity, when they do the right tests. 30 to 60% of who comes into a doctor's office. Now, it's not the whole world because not everyone's going to their doctor's office, but if they don't feel good and they're going to see a doctor for some reason, 30 to 60% of them are coming back positive on a test for gluten sensitivity. There's never been anything like this before. And some doctors can't believe that that's even possible, so they don't explore the possibility because it's so outrageous a number. But when you see it time and time again, and you see your MS patients getting better, you see your thyroid patients with the antibodies going down, you see your children with attention deficit, the teacher telling the parents that new drug you're giving your child is really working, and the parent says, we aren't giving him a new drug, we just changed his diet. When you see this time and time again, it just opens up that there's a possibility that maybe gluten is a problem for a lot of people because no human can really digest this. So that's the frequency of it. So it's the proper testing. So can we talk about testing for a moment?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. There's two categories of testing to consider. There is the original tests, which were for celiac disease, and we're going to talk about the pros and cons of that, and then the tests for a gluten sensitivity. They're different. They're apples and oranges. Unfortunately, until just 4 years ago, there really wasn't two categories of tests that doctors would check for celiac disease, and if it came back negative, they told the patient they didn't have a problem with gluten.
Okay.
Now, that's not an accurate interpretation of the test. The test is for celiac disease. Celiac disease is only one manifestation of a gluten sensitivity. So let's talk about the celiac disease test first. The blood test to look for celiac disease is something called transglutaminase, and it's an enzyme in the cheesecloth. And it's a very, very accurate test. All of the research papers say 97%, 98%, 99% accurate, sensitive, and specific, right on the money. Every paper says that. And so the laboratories show these papers to the doctors, and the doctors say, okay, that's a good test, I'll use that test. And then the doctors order that test. And the textbooks would talk about these tests and say the same thing. And the doctors say, okay, I'll do that test. Here's the problem with that, is that the researchers who look to see, is this test accurate? And I've interviewed the researchers, they're on my summit. And they talk about this on my summit, the Gluten Summit. When they look to see if this blood test called transglutaminase was accurate to identify celiac disease, they looked at celiac patients. That makes sense, doesn't it? But to get a diagnosis of celiac disease, patients have to be at the end stage, which is their shags are all worn down and they've got berber. It's called total villus atrophy.
Okay.
But the carpet's worn down. So I wrote to many of these authors of these research papers, and dear doctor, when you looked at this, did you include patients that had partial villus atrophy or patients who were just beginning with the inflammation that causes all of this? Every one of them wrote back, no, celiac disease is total villus atrophy. So they looked at the patients that were at the end stage of the disease. And at the end stage of the disease, the test is really, really accurate. 97, 98, 99% accurate. No question about it. But the majority of people that are on the celiac spectrum, the majority of them by far, are not at the end stage yet.
Yeah.
They're somewhere in the process of getting to the end stage. That type of logic is similar to, if you've ever had a neighbor or a family member that had a heart attack and thank God they survived, and they came home after being hospitalized and they said, you know, my doctor told me I had a previous heart attack I never knew. Have you heard that before?
Yeah, I've heard.
Well, how do they know that? Because there's damage in the heart from a previous heart attack.
Yeah.
And they could see the damage in the heart. So this type of logic with celiac disease, only using a test that's extremely accurate at the end stage, is like saying if you do a cholesterol test and your cholesterol is really high, but they look to see there's no damage in their heart, say, oh, don't worry, you don't have a problem with heart disease. See, there's no damage in your heart.
Yeah.
Your heart's not worn down. So if your shags aren't worn down, if you don't have total villus atrophy, the transglutaminase test comes back with a false negative, saying there's no problem when there really is 7 out of 10 times.
Wow.
7 out of 10 times. They're on the celiac spectrum, but it comes back with a false negative because they're not at the end stage. Now, this was not intentional on the researcher's part. They just didn't think that far down the road yet.
Yeah.
But if you look at it now, you say, well, that's cherry picking your subjects to get the result you want.
Definitely.
But that's not what they did. They were very sincere, and they found a great test. It's right on the money if you have total villus atrophy. If you have partial villus atrophy, it's not accurate at all. And the result is, have you ever had friends or patients say to you, I was tested for gluten and I don't have a problem with it, but if I stop eating gluten, I feel better.
Yep.
Have you had that experience?
That's the partial, right?
Yeah, that's the partial. And that's those that also that don't have celiac, they've got some other manifestation. So it's just not showing on the test. So that's the first category of test is transglutaminase, really accurate if you're at the end stage. So if it comes back positive at any stage, you got a problem. But if it comes back negative, you can't say, I don't have a problem.
Yeah.
What you can say is, I don't have total villus atrophy. My shags aren't worn down completely. That's an accurate interpretation of the transglutaminase test that comes back negative.
Okay, so then there's the second test, which is more wide spectrum.
Exactly. The second test looks at gluten sensitivity.
Okay.
And in that test, once again, we have that big clump of pearls. The most common one is 33 pearls long. And the technical name for it is alpha gliadin, or gliadin, depending on how you pronounce it. It's 33 bricks long, or 33 pearls long. And every lab in the country looks for alpha gliadin as a test, are you sensitive to gluten? We know, though, the studies have shown us, they go as far back as 1999, that 50% of people that do not have a sensitivity to alpha gliadin, but who have celiac disease, they come back negative to alpha gliadin. But wait a minute, celiac disease is a reaction to gluten, but the test for gluten is coming back negative. How can that be? We know celiac disease is absolutely a gluten-related disorder, but the test for gluten sensitivity comes back negative. How can that be? Doctors could never answer the question. They didn't know. It didn't make any sense. Now we know that there are hundreds of clumps of the necklace that the scissors aren't breaking it down completely, and over 60 of them stimulate an immune response. So you may respond to the 33 pearl clump of gluten, but you may not. You may respond to a 17 pearl clump or an 11 pearl clump. And no laboratory ever started looking at this until 3 years ago. A lab came out that did. But the papers have been coming out since 1999 that's saying there's different clumps of necklace that may cause that immune response, that inflammation, and tear the cheesecloth. Those studies have been out there for over 14, 15 years, but no laboratory ever picked up onto it until just recently, in the last 3 years. Now there's a laboratory that looks at 10 different clumps of pearl necklace. 10 different clumps, and so you don't get the false negatives anymore, and you can identify if there's a gluten-related disorder.
That's interesting. So I know that there's people listening to this in America who can probably go out and get those tests or have it for a family member that they suspect. But if you're listening to this and you don't have access to that kind of testing, is there a way that you can start to get an idea of what might be contributing to it through eliminating these foods and seeing how you feel, or is how you feel not necessarily a good, accurate scientific measure for this kind of stuff?
That's a really good question. The countries that now are offering this test, not only in the U.S., but also in Great Britain and Ireland.
Okay.
As of December 2013, it got to Ireland and Great Britain. But yes, what anyone can do is just stop eating gluten for 3 weeks. Just give yourself 3 weeks. But you can't just put your toe in the water. You've got to dive in, meaning you can't have any. Because if you have the least little bit, you negate the test, because your body will respond to the smallest amount. General gluten will get turned back on if there is a general gluten in your body.
Yeah.
So you have to avoid it completely. That means all breads, all flours, all cookies, anything that has wheat or wheat flour or barley or rye, anything that includes beers for 3 weeks. You just stop it all and just notice what happens.
Yeah.
Then if you want, go out and have a pizza.
Yeah.
And it makes my day when patients would come in and they say, "Oh, doc, I had a pizza last night. I was sick as a dog. I felt so bad within 2 hours, or I couldn't sleep all night, or I'm so happy for you." No one can argue with you now, can they?
This is part of the evolution of medicine, surely, is people getting their own information from this kind of testing, like really getting to know themselves.
Yes.
That's surely part of it. And this seems like a great test to start that process.
It really is. And what we recommend to people, because it's so very common, if you have a gluten sensitivity, 50% of them also have a dairy sensitivity. So we recommend, and if you have the dairy sensitivity and you go off gluten, you may not see the results in 3 weeks because you're still having dairy. So we recommend just for 3 weeks, no gluten, no dairy, and no sugar for 3 weeks. Eat lots of vegetables, lots of quality meats, some rice, have some rice, rice pastas if you want, lots of vegetables and meats, some nuts if you eat nuts regularly, but just stay away from all gluten and all dairy, all yogurts and things like that for 3 weeks.
So that's a great starting point for almost anyone to do. And I think, just as an exercise in starting to feel, because I don't think that the majority of people are aware, and certainly I'm still in this process of becoming aware of how things affect, because it's not an acute issue. It's sort of a chronic type of feeling.
You would never think that the ringing in your ears could be caused by wheat, a wheat sensitivity.
Wow.
You would never think that the pain in your toe could be caused by a wheat sensitivity. You never think that. Who would ever think that? But you will find that if that's the weak link in your chain, you go gluten-free and the ringing in your ears goes down or goes away. 3 weeks, that's all it takes.
Wow, this is amazing. And given that this is such a big issue, autoimmune disease, I really appreciate you breaking down these 3 areas here. I'd like to ask you one last thing, before we wrap up, because we're running out of time. This is called the evolution of medicine. This is one area of evolution that you've seen talking about today, understanding the cause. When you sit back and think about the words, the evolution of medicine, what does that say to you on a bigger level?
From the world of my area of expertise and my specialty, people being more empowered as to how to take care of ourselves. Look, in the U.S., our healthcare system is very poor. Where we spend more than any other country per capita, and we have second from the bottom in results. We're second from the bottom of all industrialized nations. Infant mortality, early death, just across the board, we're in terrible shape. So the evolution of medicine is people getting an understanding of how to begin taking more ownership of their own health. How could you ever think eating ding-dongs and drinking Coca-Cola is going to be okay in your body? You'd never put Coca-Cola in your car, yet we'll put it in our bodies. We've been brainwashed into thinking we can put anything down there we want. Every forkful of what you put in your mouth is either inflammatory or anti-inflammatory. There's no neutrals except healthy water. Every forkful is going to turn on genes to make you healthier and stronger, or turn on genes to make you weaker and sicker. Every forkful. And so as you learn more about this, as you evolve in your understanding, you start understanding how to take better care of yourself. And the thing about gluten and gluten sensitivity is it's the most common food. Remember, every forkful? It's the most common food we eat that can cause these devastating problems that you don't feel, but they're going on internally until you hit the straw that broke the camel's back, and now you're diagnosed with lupus.
It's amazing. And it also seems like this is not something that's going to be taken care of by politics anytime soon. This is something, and you have a choice of how you vote with your dollars every day. If you want to see more clean foods and make it more available, you've got to start investing in that now so that you're sending price signals to the rest of the market saying, hey, we want more of this stuff. It's happening all around us. That's got to be a part of the evolution of medicine too.
You're absolutely right. I've had this exact discussion with some of my patients, some successful businessmen who are in their 60s, and they've had a bypass already, so they've got a new lease on life, and they like their scotch or they like what particular food. I say, I understand, you're at a stage in life where you're saying, what's the point? I like it or something. I'm doing fine. What about your grandchildren? What about your grandchildren's brain? Would you like to see them educated how they can be stronger and healthier and more vibrant? more productive in their lives now, happier in their lives, not have to be on medications by the time they're in their 20s or 30s? Would you be willing to put a little effort in making sure your grandchildren have a healthier tomorrow? And for many people, that really helps them to support this concept of healthier foods and an education about how foods may affect us.
Well, that ties into so many topics that we've got on this summit. The family as a sort of a unit of change. We're going to be talking about how stress and toxicity go down through the generations. So that your life is not just your own responsibility. You actually have responsibility for your kids, because they're developing their genetic structure and their cells from yours, and it's a function of that. So this is huge information. This has been a really enlightening talk. I think anyone who's facing autoimmune disease, or has a friend or a loved one who has autoimmune disease, it's so empowering to know this, and that there's a lot of tools that are there. I really want to thank you for being on. If you weren't part of the Gluten Summit and you'd like to, I think it's well worth getting into it. It's theglutensummit.com. There's also thedoctor.com, thedr.com, which are both Dr. Obryan's sites. I really appreciate you spending the time and being with us today. I'm sure that this is just the beginning of our relationship, and I hope that from doing audio like this and using the internet to share it out, that we can look back in 17 years and see the difference that we've all made. So thanks so much for being here, Tom.
Well, James, thank you so very much. It's really a privilege to be a part of this group that's putting on the evolution of medicine. These are cutting-edge thinkers, and if we want our attendees to think a bigger picture of how they can be healthier and their children can be healthier, they need to hear cutting-edge information. And this summit that you've put together is just remarkable for the quality of the people you've got and the information they're sharing. So it's my honor to be a part of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This has been the Evolution of Autoimmune Disease. Dr. Tom Obryan, and I'm James Maskell. It's been great being with you. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.